Hi, everybody. My name is Abdul Nazri, and today I will be presenting my Social Connections application project. My presentation is focused on understanding subtle bias and educational tracking. So, why I chose this and the cost of tracking. So, I served as a student ambassador and as a student representative on the Chev Student Advisory Committee for PVCC, Piedmont Virginia Community College. Through these roles, I've seen how educational tracking directly affects students. It helps one visualize. Tracking is the practice of separating students into different academic paths, like remedial versus honors, based on perceived ability. The problem with this system is that it disproportionately funnels marginalized students into lower academic tracks. The cost to the students is high. They end up with fewer advanced course options, different levels of college readiness, and a placement that tends to stick rather than get revisited. So, why social psychology? Why do we use social psychology to look at this issue? Traditional anti-discrimination policies usually miss the mark. They are built to catch intentional discrimination, but bias is often subtle and automatic. Psychology helps us see how these disparities are actually built into the system. So let's look at the research, starting with implicit bias. A 2009 meta-analysis by Greenwald and colleagues looked at 122 reports on the IPA, implicit IAT, I beg your pardon, the implicit association test. They found that IAT moderately predicts discriminatory behavior, and on race-related topics, it does so better than explicit self-report surveys. The numbers on this chart are correlations, so higher means better at predicting behavior. Why this matters? This honors tracking often relies on subjective teacher recommendations. The result is that automatic bias can cause equally qualified minority students to be underrecommended regardless of a teacher's sincere values. So now we move to stereotype threat. Demonstrated by Steele and Aronson in 1995, this study looked at the risk of confirming a negative stereotype about one's group. Black students performed worse on a difficult test when it was framed as measuring innate intelligence. But when researchers removed that framing, the performance gap disappeared. The bars on this slide show the pattern rather than exact scores. So why this matters? Placement exams for honors classes explicitly trigger this threat, which artificially depresses scores for marginalized students. We also have the self-fulfilling prophecy shown by Word, Zana, and Cooper in 1974. White interviewers unknowingly treated black applicants worse in nonverbal ways, like sitting further away or making more speech errors. When white applicants were later treated the exact same way, their own performance noticeably dropped. Why this matters? So, well-intentioned teachers in remedial tracks may unknowingly exhibit these same negative nonverbal behaviors. Students pick up on it, disengage, and perform poorly, creating a self-fulfilling cycle. To quickly review the methodologies and limitations of these studies, Greenwald was a meta-analysis. The predictor variable was IAT scores, and the criterion variable was discriminatory behavior. The limitation is that it shows prediction, not direct causation. Steele and Aronson used an experimental design. The independent variable was test framing, and the dependent variable was test performance. The limitation is that it relied on highly selective sample of Stanford students. Word was a two-phase experiment. The independent variable was interviewer nonverbal behavior, and the dependent variable was applicant performance. The limitation is a small sample and single university setting. Finally, Cohen was a randomized field experiment. The independent variable was the affirmation exercise versus a control writing task. And the dependent variable was course grades. The limitation is that it was studied in a specific below higher education context standard, so results may not transfer directly to the higher education platform or placement. Based on this research, my program proposes 3 policy changes. Change 1 addresses Greenwald, replace subjective teacher recommendations with objective placement metrics like blind portfolio reviews to limit the space where autonomic bias can operate. Change 2 addresses Steele, Reframe placement exams strictly as diagnostic tools for curriculum matching. Strip out any language that frames them as measuring intelligence so stereotype threat is not triggered. And change 3 addresses Cohen. Integrate values affirmation exercise into the curriculum. These are brief in-class writing exercises where students reflect on their personal values. In the study, this simple intervention with even middle schoolers narrowed the achievement gap for the lowest performing Black students, and the effects lasted over time. This leads to two applications to human behavior. First, predicting the failure of good intentions. We can predict that relying on self-reported equity surveys or teachers' stated values will not close the gap because bias operates unconsciously. Second, reframing underperformance. We can understand that underperformance in remedial tracks is often a reactive behavior to environmental pressure, not a sign of low ability. And to conclude, so in conclusion, when institutions ignore the psychology of bias, systematic inequality keeps going. The tracking system actually manufactures the underperformance it then uses to justify itself. But research-backed interventions can break this cycle and dismantle these subtle behaviors. Lastly, these are my references. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure taking this class. I learned a lot.